welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us one more time for this Cloud Lunch and Learn session. Today I have here with me Dimitar. He's going to explain all about a customer journey to the cloud starts here. I was talking to him before I start the session. He has a great knowledge and will bring some good insights, especially for companies looking to do the migration now the next couple of weeks or a couple of months. Yeah, I'm Jackson Felden from Cloud Lunch and Learn, and as you know, we are running those sessions every Wednesday. And the plan for today is to run for the next 1 hour. If you guys have any questions at any time, please feel free to just type them on the chat box, and then I will ask Dimitar to give all the needed answers. One more time, Dimitar, thanks for joining us. If you want to do a quick intro about yourself, and then I can share your screen, and hopefully we are good to go.
All right. Thank you, Jackson. Thank you for having me here in the Cloud Launch and Learn. As mentioned, my name is Dimitar Grozdanov. I am a freelance trainer, consultant, as well as an Azure MVP. Knock on wood, my 5th year in a row. I've been around for a couple of years already. Did previously work for Ingram Micro as part of their Center of Excellence team that covered cloud technologies mainly. Azure was one of my focuses there. Trainings for partners, design architecture sessions, pre-sales activities. Prior to that, I spent almost 11 years working for the local Microsoft office as a technology advisor. So I've seen and known Azure since it was Red Dog, actually. And some other experience, but that would take some time to explain. So thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, and then as we agreed before, I will keep my eye on the chat window. If there is any question, I will interrupt you, and then I can read the questions. You can answer for us, and let's try to make a bit interactive as well.
Sure.
Okay. Anyway, let me share. Yeah, let me share your screen and here. I believe now is shared. And yeah, Dimitar, I think now the floor is yours. I will be here on the background. If you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, yeah, you can start. Okay,
thank you.
I will talk to you later.
All right. So welcome everybody. Again, kind of a short intro on myself. I have an intro slide. Been here for a while. I'm an actual old man yelling at the cloud. These are some of the links and or profiles you might find me. I'm pretty active in the Macedonian IT Pro user group. There's a couple of locations we can find some additional information. The contact email, if you want to share something, reach out, get in touch. No worries. I'm here. I'm always open for any form of discussion. Now, as far as the topic of today, I don't have a kind of an agenda, but this is the must read, right? So we're going to talk about cloud adoption framework and certain aspects, and I'm going to try to convene some of my experience that I had with the framework itself. Another important piece of or component in the whole Azure cloud adoption process would be the well-architected framework for Azure that handles topics like reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, and last but not least, performance efficiency. There is also a bunch of Azure reference architectures you will find within the portal, which will help you plan, design, architect of your environment, so you can utilize all the resources there and amend and expand these. Hopefully, there's a couple of initiatives that some GitHub repositories will pop up that will actually try to extend the portfolio Microsoft has with some community knowledge there as well. You also have the design patterns, which mainly reflect developer or DevOps operations in regards to how things would change when you move from a static environment like on-premises data center to a dynamic asynchronous distributed environment like cloud. And last but not least, so there is a bunch of resources, but these are what I like, the Azure subscription limits and quotas. I would add here also the naming conventions, because this can shift certain aspects of how naming conventions on an Azure resource can reflect maybe what you have on premises and or how it mixes with other resources as well, since different resources have different nomenclatures for specific names. As Jackson mentioned, if there are any questions, he has full authority to interrupt me so I can address them during the actual session and the slides. So what's the point of a specific cloud adoption journey or what we actually try to achieve, right? It all boils down to what are we going to build, right? We need to start and look at the foundational principles so we can actually properly build what is expected from us, right? It can be a house, well, maybe not a Lego house, but it has a lot of elements. So as a real house, it can be a tree house for that matter. It can be a dog house, a bird house, whatever, right? It can be as complex or as big as a stadium, for example, or a business building or a district or something like that. Or again, one of the marvels of engineering would be also the bridge. Now, different projects, yeah, they're all building type, but then we have different approach in order for us to achieve the ultimate goal, right? Creating the appropriate project and make it function and work, right? Now, from that standpoint, right, we still have certain basic building principles or planning principles that we need to go through, right? It also applies to the cloud adoption and cloud building and cloud migration principles for that matter, right? For that purpose, Microsoft constructed and actually still revises on an ongoing base the cloud adoption framework, right? And this is the high level representation, and these are the main topics we're going to discuss today, right? I know it's a conceptual thing. It gives you a certain aspects. Yeah, it's not a maybe a hands-on type of session at this point, but it will take you actually gradually from the defining of the strategy, which will be things like understanding motivations, what are the specific business outcomes, what is the business justification from one side, and how to determine how we can prioritize certain projects. Then it moves to the planning phase, right? We need to look at what we have in a form of a digital estate, right? What are those services that we run inside? What are the components of the services? What's the dependency? Is it a hardware-based type of service? I mean, connected to specific hardware, to a virtualization environment? How we can move it, right? And what are the options for moving it to the cloud? There is also an important part of the so-called organizational alignment, sorry. Because as we move to Azure or move certain workloads to Azure, then certain operations that we already done and we like doing them, we need to adapt and modify those, right? We might need also to think of different organizational structure for our operation teams, right? Extending their capabilities from an on-premises mindset to a cloud mindset. Now that will follow a business and technology type of discussion and then realignment, and we're going to spend some time talking about that one, but also the skills. I mean, you cannot expect that you would come on a meeting, for example, with me, and I know everything about cloud adoption framework and start throwing things at you and you're baffled, right? You need to drive the conversation from your side. Yes, you're subject matter experts in the areas where you work and operate, but then I come from the side and start throwing in some ideas and planning and tooling and blah, 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 right? And you could get confused at the end of the day, right? And that's the defensive stance. And that would be a hard no for certain things. And I have stories about hard no's, right? Which means whatever we consider from the strategy and planning phase, we need to construct the appropriate cloud adoption plan because it will take time. It's not Friday to Monday operation, although I had a scenario like that as well. Then we're going to look at the readiness, explain the basic principles, and trust me, within this every area, we can spend hours of talking. I'm going to touch upon the adoption with specific focus on migration, and then finish with the GRC side, right? Governance, risk compliance, or security governance and management side. Now, let's gradually dig into the strategic part, right? And this is where technology meets business. Now, there is always a motivation why I should start using the cloud, right? We might be perfectly happy with what we have on premises. We have invested in resources, meaning hardware, software components. The operational model is there, so appropriate people, appropriate skills of the people are there, and we successfully run it, right? Now, at a certain point of time, there will be a decision to move. Now, it can happen, like I had it many times, a CEO or a C-level executive in a company talks with a high-level representative of Microsoft specifically, and then suddenly they come. I actually had a little scenario like this on Friday, picks up all the personnel from IT, says on Monday we're moving to the cloud. Yeah, nice, but I don't think it can happen. So there is a specific, either a critical business event or an idea that spans across the business, and then it will streamline its way towards the IT, right? Now, as far as the criticality goes, it can be a replacement of a legacy hardware component or environment, or the maintenance for those components is so expensive these days, we either need to replace them, which means a new capital investment, or expand and move certain workloads to the cloud, right? It can be a merger acquisition or a kind of diversifying of the portfolio of companies. So larger companies, enterprise companies tend to do this operations, which means we either need to do a capital investment in the currently establish data center infrastructure and capabilities to expand the portfolio, or we might use a cloud environment for this. Now, in general, anything that's a form of a kind of a startup and or a kind of a beginners type of business would probably look at cloud initially. But anything that has a legacy systems means that need to reconsider, right? There is a significant investment in people, time, and materials that was done for those environments. So we need to expand and move things, right? So one thing always is a capital expenditure. I've seen a couple of scenarios where either a storage SaaS system is so old that replacement would be not that cost effective for the budget for a certain entity, which means they needed to explore different options. So cloud was one of the options. End of support, right? Microsoft offers specific support capabilities for certain versions of an operating system, including Windows Server with CQL, where we can get extended security updates, for example, in the Azure. It might be something related to very specific regulatory or data sovereignty requirements that first will limit where I can move in the cloud, right? Depending on the geography of the data centers, but also what I can move inside. So whether it's something that they need to offload somewhere and keep it somewhere, or it's a kind of a non-business critical, non-mission critical, or non-high business impact system that actually does not handle that type of data, but also I can amend and expand those capabilities. And working for Microsoft, I spent 2 years talking with different customers just about security compliance, data sovereignty, and things like that. I never spoke about any specific service. 2 years just spent about GRC, right? And then it would be a reduction of any disruptions, right? If not looking at the past 2 years, we learned a lot about business disruptions, supply chains disruptions, not to mention scenarios going on in Ukraine these days. So it affects any aspect of the business. Now, if it's a local company, maybe they won't notice that on a kind of a technology level, but mid-sized, larger companies that operate sometimes beyond the borders, or they expect something to be provisioned from an external provider, they sure suffer from the changes that happened, and the critical infrastructure became very critical these days, right? Now, once we decide what are the critical business side, we need to see what are our migration and eventually do the innovation motivations. Now, I'm going to focus on the migration side, right? It can be cost saving, reduction of specific complexity, third-party tooling and or streamlining and kind of condensing the third-party tooling environment, further optimizing the IT operations, well, any form of operations, right? IT related, I mean security, dev, network, whatever it's operation-wise. The business agility increase means for certain segments will be an important thing, not only in a vertical perspective, but also in the size of the company and eventually region, but eventually somebody will find their way towards a specific cloud endpoint, right? It's also part of the modernization of the services. At least I can do some tests, see if it works. If it's not, I can go back and say, okay, this is not for me. So yeah, it is a process, but it can happen. Now, there is also a financial consideration, right? So that's the capital versus the operational expenditure, right? Instead of investing in new hardware and software infrastructure, in tools, in any components for monitoring, operating the environments, we can actually stretch our environment to the cloud, utilize the capabilities of the cloud environment, and switch from capital to operational expenditure. So quick provisioning, the provisioning of the services. So it is an accounting process. It is also a process, right? In some cases, it requires a kind of a more complex analysis, right? Total cost of ownership, things like that. But it is done, right? And this is the financial side, and this is what the business and finance people would ask eventually, ultimately for us. It's just not that, okay, I need Azure subscription. I'm going to spend, I don't know, $10,000 per month. This is it. They won't like that. I've seen a lot of IT managers failing to explain to the business why they need the specific budget, why they need the specific trainings, why they need to introduce the specific tools and services, even for on-premises. And trust me, for cloud, it's not always easy. It's shifting, but still, IT is the people that spend money inside the org for different gadgets they like. Still ongoing like that. 10, 15 years already, we're still on that, the IT crowd level. Right. Now, from a technical benefit side, which is the IT pro side, let's say, and dev side, it's scalability, availability, the embedded security and compliance, and then the capacity optimization I can achieve in the cloud, right? Right, not to go into the definition what the public cloud means, right? Highly virtualized, highly available distributed environment, right? And again, we can still debate between multi-vendor, vendor lock-ins and things like that people don't like, but it is a step towards our cloud journey, and our focus here is Microsoft Azure primarily. Now let's gradually move towards our next order of thing, which is the planning. Now, being a hands-on person for years, I like doing hands-on stuff, but complex environments require a very proper strategy and planning process to be done. Which also means sometimes that we would spend a lot more time on strategizing and planning, and yes, talking with the boring business side of the people and the business owners, business unit owners, and people on the where the, let's say, finance administration processes, not to mention the governance risk compliance side. But it is an important step, right? And this will determine whether we're going to be successful or not ultimately, right? I mean, it's a journey, and it's all about the journey actually before we reach the destination, right? It's not where the place where we will, but how we actually run that journey across the process. Now, the process actually of the planning would evolve around these 4 pillars, if I kind of oversimplify things. Right? The rationalization of the digital estate, the initial organizational alignment, the skill readiness plan, and then drafting the cloud adoption plan that will actually reflect the strategy and the planning components inside. And yes, there is a subset of tools and templates you can use from cloud adoption framework that will help you jumpstart. I even recommend people create a cloud adoption plan for a smaller entity where there is not much hassle in regards to digital estate, number of services running, right? Some complex organizational alignment, just because it's a good exercise. Now, skill readiness and organizational alignment are very important. I've worked with customers that actually almost failed miserably because they enforced, for example, skills readiness, but the organizational alignment was not up to speed. They spend a lot of time on analyzing, rationalizing the digital estate, but they did not spend enough time on organizational alignment. I'll throw in some samples there. Now, as far as the rationalization goes, right, it is a process where we look at what we have, right? We create an inventory. Any form of an asset, meaning any form of a service we run inside, whether it's only an application, is it comprised on a specific application with runtime environment, software additional components, in-house, third-party, specific hardware that operates beneath, right? No matter if it's virtualized, there is hardware somewhere, it's network, it's additional security components. Then we have the operating systems running and any specific performance counters inside, right? Now, this is a process, and this can be a very long process, depending on how many assets we have or services we run. Yeah, if it's, I don't know, 2, 3, 5, 10, 50, could be a reasonable time frame. I don't know, between 40 and 80 hours per month would be enough to analyze the things and then draft the appropriate order in which the services will move to the cloud. But we have hundreds and hundreds of services. That implies complexity. That implies a very complex and sometimes organizational structure. We have a skilling challenge as well. And then we have to figure out which would be the at least top 10 services that will move to the cloud. We always go for the Americans used to say low-hanging fruits, but some cases, yeah, it works in most cases, like move the website or the front-end mail server, if I talk about other services, but might imply that I need to look at networking, the hybrid connectivity, the governance, risk, compliance, security things, right? And then there are 2 components we can do. One is the quantitative, the other one is quality analysis, right? The quantity is usually the first one that we look. Well, it is a basic thing. Well, do I really need this service at this point in my life cycle of the IT, or I can do something with it? Replace it, remove it, whatever, right? Is this specific service well-sized? Yeah, in on-premises, we do have a kind of capital investment and overestimated the investment in the resources. So we have breathing room in our disk space, the virtual CPUs, the memory I can allocate. Well, it's fine, right? I have run a couple of Azure Migrate analysis of an on-premises virtual machine environments. In a couple of cases, we realized that there is like 25 to 30% dead weight VMs running inside and nobody knows what they do and they're just there. And if we went with the migration, they would have actually gone to the cloud and just generated cost there. So that's one optimization step, right? I mean, it also helps us determine what are the dependencies, and dependencies are important. This knows which batch of services or assets are grouped somehow together, and they either need to move together or their life cycle is bound together, so they would actually need to be appropriately managed, and then the 5R of the rationalization would kick in, right? Now the qualitative analysis, it is primarily focusing on the actual solution, right? It's a specific application service, belongs to a specific business unit, right? And we need to talk with the business side here. With the quantitative, let's face it, we in the IT can do it. I mean, we can see the basic parameters, what's going on. We can map the services, create the service maps, whatever needs to be done, and we would know which would be, this is the easy service. Now, that can be tricky with the monolithic environments. I work with those, and this specific, for example, monolithic environment had a silo model where everything evolved around the security, governance, and risk of the application service. So every component from the inventory actually was bound to a single silo based on what the application did. And everything was structured around that. Now, breaking that monolithic model, and they wanted to go to Kubernetes. Now, that was a hard fight, right? Because the GRC segment did not want to release the control, and suddenly we moved from a highly monolithic and closed environment to a distributed, fairly open, let's say, if I may use the term, right, to our internal services, meaning not to people outside, but kind of, well, it's distributed and asynchronous model of operations. So it was tough, and I'm talking about almost 200 applications. I'm not talking about one monolithic application there. They did it ultimately, but it took some time. Now, either way, there is two approaches that we can do in the rationalization, which we tend to do, especially, well, it's kind of a cost-saving process. We do it incrementally. Right, we reduce the discovery data points, so we kind of cheat on the corners, so cut corners on the inventory of the assets, the application software, but it does not mean that we forget things. Right? It's just meant to streamline the decisions, because I don't know, 100 applications, if we calculate that I need between 40 and 80 hours, depending on the complexity, to analyze and create the inventory and do the analysis of the asset, multiply that by 100 or 200 different services. It will take time. It might take a couple of months just to create the inventory. So we need to be efficient here, right? We do some temporary assumptions, but the idea here is when we come to a certain point, we do some challenging of those assumptions. So there will be a person on the other side, because we cannot challenge our own assumptions. There has to be some sounding board model here, where somebody will tell us, well, why don't you consider retiring the assets or do some form of a transformation? Now, that transformation can be run in parallel. And I've seen projects like that because they run a lot of forms of cloud workshops, and they split the teams, then they do POCs, they kind of positive feedback the information, and they still come back to the same group of people where the ultimate decisions are done, right? Now, selecting the first workload, or the first 10 or first 3, first 5, whatever makes it work for you, would be the business, the technical criteria, the qualitative analysis we're going to do, and eventually the cost model alignment, because it will be there. Now, the 5 R's of the process would mean, how do I gonna move over there, right? There is the rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, or create a new one, and retire is the 5th one. Now, the rehost is, as a fellow MVP colleague used the term, move and improve. I move something to the cloud as a raw infrastructure service, right? A virtual machine for that matter, where I move it to the cloud side and I improve the operations by utilizing certain capabilities of the cloud. It can be as simple as, well, nothing is simple. It can be the security patching for 2 years for that currently unsupported to us, right? It can be keep it in a kind of safe harbor there, where I can enable some governance models, so I streamline who can access to it, who hasn't. Refactoring is the cool thing, which actually implies if I can move the service, and I would suggest you look that one first. If I can move it to a platform service from a virtual machine or an infrastructure service to a PaaS service, then do it. Usually it can be a minimum code corrections, except if it's a very old runtime, so I cannot move it, and there is no kind of governance requirements that I need to keep that instance of the VM for X number of years. Can happen. Re-architecting means that this application or the digital asset I'm trying to move has no clue what Azure Cloud is, so I need to start from scratch. And this is where the architecture center and the design patterns and anti-patterns will kick in, right? Rebuild and renew is scratch everything and start from ground zero. Now, if you have an option to also replace that specific workload with a software as a service when you do your due diligence, then also do that. Microsoft would suggest that thing, but might help things in the long term. And then last but not least, is just retire the service. Now, nothing of this would be possible unless we try to do some form of an organizational alignment. And this is a very important component. And trust me, the guys with the 200 applications I mentioned, they actually missed a step here, which was problematic because they were almost in the midterm of their analysis and things like that. Right? So we can either restructure the organization, which for a larger entity, it's difficult. Right? The bigger the company is, the more locations they have around the world. So shifting the organizational chart first is a long and painful process, which means we need to create a new organogram that will match the cloud side of the story. Most common option is, so one option is create virtual teams, which means decomposition everything, create the virtual teams by combining assets from around the world, preferably, right? If it's a larger company, and then create a new organ, and kind of do not change the organizational chart. And this is the most common way how people do it, actually. The other option is mixed model, right? Now, this implies a certain maturity level of the organization in regards to the cloud, which means I have a virtual teams, including with the standard organizational structure, and then it's part of our digital transformation process. Now, the model behind it is the RACI matrix, right? Responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Now, if you look at the whole maturity process, right, adoption only, the minimum viable product, centralized IT, strategic alignment, operational alignment, cloud center of excellence. The bigger you are, the further you will go down the line. Now, what we usually start, and this is kind of a good start even for most of the small and mid-sized companies, but also for some of the enterprise companies that want to see how it goes, create a kind of two virtual teams, right? Cloud adoption side and the cloud governance. Because if you miss the governance side, then they would kick you somewhere at the point. I was working on a prior to New Year on some governance analysis, so I needed to do assessment of a current governance state and how the adoption of the services goes. And we were about to kind of literally sign off the process, at the documentation, the findings at the end of the month, and suddenly an email comes from the governance teams, which is a thing that was supposed to come 2 years ago when the actual project started. With all the documentation prepared and everything there, I asked a couple of times, do you have the sign off? Yes, this is the security paper, this is the governance papers, everything was there. But they never moved them internally from draft to a kind of a released version. So they started complaining about things that everybody knows. What's the data sovereignty principles? Is the data secure? What are the rules? How this is being processed, etc. They actually stopped and delayed the process for 3 months. Because once the government's people kick in with the documentations and papers and looking at different things, things can get crazy. Now, this is a good starting point, right? The cloud adoption team will look at the technology types, solutions, things like that. They will have the appropriate skills for that, communicate with external people, and initial phases, I would also kind of advise to communicate either with the vendor or with your solution partner working, or if you're the solution partner, approach the customer there. So they will have your support in the process or some form of an external process support. I mean, me coming in your organization and start asking weird questions might steer some things that you were looking at them but never been aware. Happened to me. So the sounding board model would be a thing to consider, right? But once we kind of look at the cloud adoption and cloud governance, and you can start small in an enterprise environment like this, right? The POCs, the workshops and everything, it's a kind of a learning process. You adopt to the planning and the strategy process. You see what the migration processes are. You can learn. You can start talking to business to you, vice versa, right? And kind of align the processes between the teams. Now, as it scales further, it will come to a form of a centralization of IT operations, because maintaining multiple cloud adoption teams on one side, and usually the cloud governance side, it's a single environment side on that one, can get complex. I mean, because some of the operations would be attached to specific cloud administration group, so they will lose sight. So the RACI matrix will start failing here, right? Responsible, accountable, right? Consultant, informed. So we go gradually towards centralizing the IT team, centralizing the cloud governance, and the cloud platform strategy type of operations, right? Cloud platform operations, right? And then we set up different communication channels between the centralized IT personnel and specific teams there, right? Now, you can still be part of a cloud adoption story, but the centralized IT would manage and maintain the team alignment in that case. Now I'm missing here the business. If we expand further, we'll have the governance. We have the business side of the people, but either way, this is a way how we can further mature, right? In a kind of a highly matured organization, we do have the strategic alignment, where there is a kind of a overall team that will actually, based on inputs from the cloud adoption, tests, POCs, right, investigations of technology capabilities, they will actually draft and move the cloud strategy further. It's a long-term process, and cloud is constantly evolving and changing. So it's a kind of a, it's like a tornado that cuts us in and then spins us around a little bit. And it also supports the operational alignment. And this is what the center of excellence side would be in that story. But yeah, we can spend million minutes and hours on this topic if we kind of look at it on a per case scenario. The organizational skills, although this is a kind of a high level representation from Microsoft side, is important. Right. It's not just the fancy title I get during organizational realignment, and I'm cloud something something, digital transformation something something. So my title has its own business card or a kind of a 17 lines of a signature line in my email. It means that we need to be aware of what technologies and concepts we are adopting and how it will evolve within the teams. So this will mean also shuffling of team members and putting developers and IT professionals working together. Now, the customer I mentioned, for example, they did a lot of trainings, and I was part of their training portfolio group. And at a certain point, I started asking, okay, I see a lot of people here, but I never see the governance, the security personnel, and the networking. And I said, okay, security and governance, they have their different trainings, but okay, we're talking about architecture, design, security, so they should be here. And the thing that surprised me most was that the networking people or group of people were outsourced company, and they were not in the organogram. They were part of their teams. It was some virtual teaming component there, but they forgot. I'm talking about global multinational company that had almost 200 services inside. They forgot about the networking people and the monolithic application company. And I said, okay, how are you going to connect? Who's going to handle the network connectivity between sites, cross sites, channeling, quality of service, everything? It is the networking data center engineers. But since they were out of the normal scope of HR as a subcontractor, they were actually omitted in the thing. So they were rushed within a couple of months because they were expecting that their respective company would do that for them. Figured out that it's not happening, so they were actually rushed through different trainings inside the company's group. And then, but everybody forgot about that. So everybody did the business alignment, and we want to move to the cloud. It's strategic and everything, blah blah blah. But at the end, the networking personnel was left out of the story. And in my case, in my opinion, in that their structure, that was one of the important parts because they had a lot of security restrictions and capabilities inside that needed to be somehow integrated with the cloud. Now, everything here, it's supported by specific role-based certification of Microsoft. If we look at the overall process, right, as per the template, so we look at the prerequisites. So we see what we need to do, create an appropriate business story, do our due diligence, do the digital estate, map the skills that we need to do, structure the initial cloud adoption and cloud governance teams at least before we progress further, because it's work in progress. It will be updated. So it's not like we do it now and we never change it. We define and prioritize which workloads will be there. Now, first 10 is for enterprise, but it can be first 3 or even 1 if you like. And then figure out how you're going to actually approach it. Then align the assets, right? Meaning, depending on what I selected as a prioritized workload, what's its interconnection, what are the dependent services, and right, build up on that. Do the rationalization process, the feedback and everything. Define the iterations and releases, so define specific milestones. You can also use Azure DevOps for this operation. There is a template that you can actually embed it there. It will allow you to acquire new skills, but you can still use Excel and Word documents provided here, no problems. And then establish a specific timeline. Once you do that, you start the next step of the journey there. Now, each time you do a kind of a challenge, and then you need to change something, you go back, change it, and then we move further. All right, readiness phase. Still no questions there, just checking the group. All right, if there is something, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think you are explaining too good. Yeah, no questions so far. Everything's
so
clear.
Yeah, okay, I'm not going to cut words now and see.
Okay, all good. Yeah, no problem.
All right, thank you. So readiness phase. So it is the first step and our entry point to the cloud. This is the way how we introduce ourselves with Microsoft Azure and the tools and the capabilities, and Azure says hi from the other side. So I'm going to talk about the importance of how to set up the initial environment, a little bit around the concept of the landing zones, and what we can do and how we can do validations in that area. Now, the landing zone, it's an abstract concept, right? It gives us the foundation, how we can actually build our services inside, how we can run them inside, how we can scale, secure, govern them, what are the networking and identity requirements and components inside overall within the environment. Right? It enables us the starting point, how we can do migrations, whatever method we have chosen, move and improve, rehost, re-architect, rebuild, or replace with software as a service. Also give us a foundational layout so we can build new services there. Right? We won't be building new services on premises anymore if we have already one foot in the Azure on the other side. Right? We need to also to consider all the platform resources. So out of the 180 something, almost 200 services, let's say in Azure, what are the important ones which will be part of our landing zone as a kind of a core concept? And then how, which is the foundational layout, and then how we're going to build up, right? It's a house, then it's a second floor, third floor, fourth floor, the roof, whatever, right? Or if it's a bridge, then we construct over it. We don't differentiate between infrastructure and platform services. Yeah, if I have infrastructure workloads, I can mix them with platform workloads, no problem there. I mean, it's either or, but it would be, it's feasible to mix them. And I worked on a couple of projects where certain workloads were running inside a VM, while other are running on a PaaS service. And by the way, they're still running. One of the easiest things is when it's a greenfield deployment. So the other side of the cloud, on the cloud, it's empty, right? Nothing happened there. Maybe somebody initiated and opened the subscription, but that would be it. Now, if we go to the planning phase, we would also need to plan the appropriate placement and number of subscriptions we can run inside, because this will help us in extending certain governance, security, as well as resource limits capabilities. And most of the enterprise organizations actually run multiple subscriptions within their environments, not only for the cost and financial side, where I can actually split per business units or applications I run, what is the cost, so I can put it on a cost center, but also the capacity. So the guys I mentioned run 5 different environments for 200 applications. So it's around 1,000 applications of specific infrastructure. It's based on Kubernetes. So at a certain point, they would hit the limits. Now, this is important when we do a kind of a planned or structured deployment. We need to make sure that we don't hit any service limit inside the environment. Otherwise, the deployment will stop. So everything is new, crispy, clean, fresh, right? So we can start the planning and strategizing from scratch, which is cool. The worst case scenario here would be that somebody already did something, or they did some due diligence, proof of concept, things like that, started deploying the environments. But especially it's tough if they don't follow the design and planning considerations and the business things and alignments, organizational and skills, right? I mean, yeah, but I like playing around Azure and different cloud services or components, and then but that's not for business-related processes, right? If I want to see how technology works, then I'll spend a couple of hours, couple of days, couple of weeks doing something. But I wouldn't do that and leave it to production, right? So, but it can also be a situation where a certain migration was initiated and they stopped for various reasons, and then we need to go back and figure out what's going on. Now that's a tough spot, because fixing other people's wrong decisions, or let's kind of use a harsh word, mistakes, it's difficult, especially if there is not enough documentation to support why the process was like this. And we need to either go around or try to do the 5 R's on the already deployed environments, and nobody likes that, because it's time, money, and resource investment already made. So we have to work around that one. But yeah, can happen. Found those as well. As far as the landing zones, right? So we need to look at the Azure billing and the structure of our Active Directory tenant environment, right? The billing reflects what's the appropriate number and type of subscriptions. Is it production, dev, test, staging? How do I going to procure them? Am I going to use a CSP provider, an enterprise agreement, or something else? Then how do I structure the Active Directory tenant environment, right? The creation, which is important in the early step, and this is part of the ready actually component. The identity access management also part of the readiness because it's bound to the Active Directory. Is it a cloud-based identity repository, an enterprise identity repository to rule them all? Is it somehow connected to on-premises, and how? Is it pass-through, password hash, federation? Do I interconnect with other business-to-business, business-to-consumer environments so I can invite vendors and people working as an external contractors to the environment? Or I have a service that actually authenticates against the consumer service, so I will actually streamline that process. You have the resource organization, which is part of the governance model, and the network topology and connection of the environment. On the compliance side, we have the security governance management and then forms of platform automation, including or excluding DevOps operations. There is a subset of resources we can use because there is the Landing Zone Accelerator, which is a kind of rather complex. It is documented on cloud, the Cloud Option Framework portal. It also has a GitHub repository, which will give you a kind of a click-through process. It's a kind of a jumpstart kit you can use that will give you a streamlined process how you can deploy certain services. Now, you should be aware, if you don't know what the services are and how they work, please read upon them prior to clicking. Otherwise, it will start deploying things and it will generate cost. It will embed certain Defender capabilities as well as install, I don't know, firewall appliances like Azure Firewall or something like that. So it's a kind of an end-to-end process running the whole high-level architecture in a kind of a scripted manner. The most common recommendation I work with is the start small and then expand. Right? I start with a couple of selected workloads. We lay the foundation and then we move further and building it. A larger entity that has a couple of hundred, even 1,000 services that needs to deploy, then they go directly to the enterprise scale. There's no question asked there. Now, you have two other options in here. You have the partner landing zones, which might be you creating a landing zone concept for an application of service that your customer has. So you actually prep the conceptual environment, which is a neat way also to kind of practice within your own teams before you position that one to the customer. Or it can be third-party HashiCorp Terraform. It's kind of popular within the structures there, but I would expect that this would expand as we progress further and utilize different kind of automation and infrastructure as a code environments. Just as a kind of short construct, what a landing zone is. So it's a conceptual architecture. It belongs to a subscription. It has certain application and or multiple applications that somehow are connected with all the corresponding resources inside, right? Whether it's a virtual machine, whether it's a container, whether it's a database, a storage account, whatever service is there, infrastructure or PaaS, it has its own identity and access management capabilities. Certain policies can be assigned, security management in regards to security certificates, application secrets, things like that. I have a monitoring construct on top of it. Now, this landing zone concept allows me to do and construct shared services capabilities and interconnect with other services, kind of be a hub and spoke model, integrate with on-premises networking if it's necessary, right? And I have a kind of a closed environment for managing the costs, governance, as well as securing that environment. Now, if I go back and expand to the enterprise landing architecture, now you see a little bit of more complexity. Now, it will take me at least half an hour to go through all of this because to give you, but it is part of the Cloud Option Framework. I just wanted to give you a point of reference. And you might find also additional sessions that handle the landing zone concepts by itself. Now, once we decide what now we don't need to check all the boxes immediately. We can start small and then expand, which means usually governance, management, security are not the things that are kind of main focus in a small mid-sized deployments as well as kind of start small scenarios. We work on those, but we do not enforce them. In the enterprise landing zone, we put everything, right? All check boxes must be, we always need to go through, document everything, prep, align, skills, that's it, right? Now, ultimately, how it looks in a kind of a maturity process, right? We start with some form of a decentralized operations, right? If it's a small entity, then we have to move certain workload. Do not reinvent the hot water. Why complicate things if it's a kind of a straightforward scenario? In this case, we go with the basic recommendations of the actual well architected framework for Azure. It covers all the 5 important areas there. If we move towards a kind of a centralized operations in a kind of a larger entity, multiple services that we need to run, kind of double, triple digit number of services, we again start small. We lay out the foundation of the platform, right? The basic concepts and construct. We start building our landing zone and then put the workloads inside. With an enterprise operations, we still build the same foundational principle. This is our entry point. This is our starting ground, whether it's house, stadium, or a bridge. Then we create one or more landing zones depending on what workloads we run. It can be dev, test, staging, production. It can be application related, right? It's all part of the fine tuning of the design. Last but not least would be once we expand that to our distributed operations on a global level, then we can combine central with enterprise operations. It seldomly goes to decentralized operations. It's usually a combination of central and enterprise operations, which might make sense if you have multiple offices around the world where you have certain pool of resources that needs to be run locally in regards to specific regulation and or services related to that entity. Then you can actually create multiple landing zones, one covering enterprise operations, the other centralized operations for a specific region. Either way, it is a way how you can proceed depending on what's the environmental complexity in your org. Now, once we set up the foundations, right, we can think about the adoption. One side is the migration, the other side would be the innovation. I'm not going to talk about innovation, it takes a lot of time, but the migration process, again, it is a thing that we need to discuss also in details, and different tools are there. But once we assess the specific workloads within the technical fit, right, we validate their technical readiness and the suitability for migration. We perform the actual migration by replicating somehow the workloads. It can be as simple as replicating the VM up to replicating the solution in a rehosting or I don't know, re-architecting model, right? Then we need to look at the costs and billing process, right? Understand the tooling, the capabilities there, and kind of map them to the solution. Once it starts running, we monitor and try to optimize operations before we move to production. Right? Because one thing is what we do on a calculator and say, okay, this is the operational cost and operational processes involved. But once we start running the service there, we would see the actual cost happening. We'll see the bottlenecks, and we'll get feedback from the platform capabilities there. And then if you need to get assistance, do not hesitate to reach out to external expert or expand your team, at least on a temporary base, of course. You do not need to run it all the time. You might need be on a temporary base, on a kind of a check-in base, right? This is some of the portfolio of the migration scenario that Microsoft has, and has a specific documentation and model for it, out of which it's also, they're not mentioned explicitly, but also containers is also an option to move specific application workloads to containers rather than infrastructure machines, right? Meaning Windows or Linux servers. And there is specialized scenarios in regard to security of the workloads, mainframes, NetApp files, and SAP HANA. Now, last but not least component here would be the security governance and management, or kind of GRC, governance risk compliance. Microsoft tends to talk about it. Now, yeah, we can spend again gazillion hours on this. The govern model relies on cost management, the security baseline, the resource consistency, the identity baseline, and the deployment acceleration capabilities. Now, the cost management side, the name says it all. We need to continually evaluate and reevaluate the costs. It's not only related to the money and the budget, but also any shifts in the costs might influence issues with the design, the architecture, or something happening with the service that we're not aware, and it will be reflected maybe at the beginning on the cost side. We need to, so the recommendation is to do at least 2 weeks with the application owner, the cloud adoption team, or the IT operations team personnel, and the business and finance side, a kind of evaluation there. The security baseline, it's what are my acceptable policies for security that can enforce within any component running in the environment, so I can maintain my security posture, wherever it is. How do I expand what I have on-prem with the cloud, and how I integrate and create a healthy mesh there, right? The resource consistency and looks at automation, predictive deployment patterns, templating, infrastructure as a code, right? If I run some automation process once successfully, it will run 1,000,000 times, unless I change something in the code, and then I need to test it and make sure it works, or something changes maybe on the side of the services or the architecture, so I need to rethink about it. The identity baseline is the identity and access management, because ultimately in the cloud, yes, it is a hosted Azure Active Directory service here, but we manage and maintain the accounts inside. How do we integrate, synchronize? How do we perform the authentication authorization process? Do we require additional security components inside, as well as it is our centralized identity repository. Bottom line, this would be right. And again, we have an identity baseline based on which we protect these identities because they're valid for named and unnamed users inside my environment. And last but not least would be the deployment acceleration, would be the DevOps CI/CD processes we can integrate in IT Ops as well. The management side, it's inventory and visibility, operational compliance, protect and recover, platform operations, and workload operations, right? We start with determining what are the basic tools. They can be Azure-based tools. It can be something on premises. We can integrate. It can be any third-party tool, right? It is something that we maintain inside the environment and make sure that preferably avoid situation when you use multi-tooling for the same operation. I had a scenario like that. They used 3 different tools because the reports in one were better. The other one gave something else. Nobody wanted to do some scripting or kind of automation process around it. So it's kind of multi-tooling. Yeah, it's either single point of failure with one expert knowing all 3 tools, or 3 people that need to create composite reports at the end of the day, right? On the operational compliance, any form of a configuration drifts. And there are tools in Azure that can enable us to monitor not only something that's configuration drift on premise in the cloud, but also on premises. Right? Protect and recover. Right? There are built-in functionalities in the PaaS and software as a service environments that enable this capability, but there is also a capability that you can extend and embed the data center operations with the cloud operations and kind of extend this component, including any form of platform operation, for example, with I don't know, Azure Arc, for that matter, would be a thing. And then any form of telemetry I can aggregate, whether I use the Azure Monitor or Splunk for that matter, I need to understand what's going on. I need to know what parameters I'm collecting, what's the analysis, and what's the automated response, if any. Last but not least, here in the methodology of the security would be the access control, the security operations, the asset protection, the governance of the security, and innovations that I can introduce by using automation processes and some artificial intelligence and machine learning components for that, right? So Microsoft runs under the zero trust model, right? And defense in depth combined in this case. Now, yeah, zero trust is kind of paranoid at the end of the day, but this is the new ways of how things are done. We see what's going on with the cyber attacks and things like that. As I used to say to one of my customers that did not trust me that, and they had an issue, you're never not interesting or too small for a DDoS or an external hacker or crypto or whatever, right? Once you plug in yourself to the internet, it becomes brutal. That's what one of my Microsoft services colleagues used to say. Once you assign yourself a public IP, it becomes brutal. Something will scan that endpoint in a very short time. I was setting up a demo environment once and left on a community name domain controller virtual machine public IP address. Within the first hour, I had 1800 network, 1800, that is, right? Network logon attempts with a generic administrator account on that domain controller. Well, the other 2 machines did not help that one. The second one was backup domain and the third one was file server. I have currently in my repository almost 5 million network logon attempts collected since 2016, roughly. And they don't run 24/7, by the way. Right. So as kind of a key takeaways before we wrap up the session and kind of a look if there is some questions or need something to be clarified, right? Yes, as IT people, we need to understand the business priorities and motivations. I would thank Microsoft for helping me realize that. After a couple of years of pre-sales and sales trainings, I realized that it's an important component. So I'm comfortable in talking with business now, right? Which is a difficult position to be as an IT person, to be put kind of straightforward there. And trust me, it spans through the management in IT up to the engineers on our side. But some people can't stand business people at the end of the day, but yeah, it's part of the company. Always validate the desired cloud operating model, right? So we try something, we see if it works, we go, right, feedback, maybe we need to do changes. Define the governance, security, and compliance from the start. Even if it's not part of the landing zone principle initially for small instances, but it is there. But for enterprise scale, it has to be there and it has to be implemented immediately, for example. Skilling and organizational alignment requirements, very important, capital letters here. I've seen people fail because they would not like to send their employees to a training, right? Yeah, you know IT. That's a virtual machine running in Azure, but it's not the same, trust me. Build a minimum basic governance foundation that will host the low risk assets. It's a learning process. It's a skilling process. It's an alignment process. So we'll have things to take back to the IT operations or in general technical operations, but also to the business side. Start deploying workloads, right? Do not plan it and then stop at a certain point, right? Deploy something, fail at something at the end of the day, right? Try to figure out what's what. Try to figure out what are the components, right? There is a million pages of information you can read. The problem is we don't have time to read everything. Even Cloud Adoption Framework is a big, and the referral documents I gave you are big. And then rinse and repeat, right? Whatever we do, go back, repeat, go back and repeat. So there is a bunch of useful links you can use, that are referred: Cloud Adoption Framework, Landing Zone concept, Microsoft Learn on Cloud Adoption Framework as well might help you and reinforce the knowledge. I hope it was interesting and educational. We still have a couple of minutes. Again, when I get passionate, I speak very fast. So if I need to refer to some clarification, feel free to ask. This is my Q&A session at the end. And,
okay, Dimitar, yeah, that was a great session. Some nice information you managed to share. Yeah, based on my experience, I would say skill is something that plays a big role. Sometimes, people, because they never done anything on the cloud, they are a little bit, behind with the knowledge, and then they are afraid of start moving things, to the cloud. But of course, they need to start somewhere. And then, yeah, the other tip is to start small, maybe add a storage, add a virtual machine, and eventually, get the confidence, get the skills, and then keep moving forward. But of course, there are so many things in regards to the security and compliance as well. It's a nice journey, but at the end, definitely pays off.
Yeah, I just saw my killer background here. All right.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I think everybody, people watching us is all fine. We didn't get any questions, so far. Yeah,
Hey,
it
if somebody
was
wants to reach out, I'm available around the social networks and everything, so I can explain something. Still, we have a lot of subtopics we can cover within the Cloud Option Framework. A lot of stories I can tell, as you mentioned. Education is important, right? Practice utilize the tools available from Cloud Option Framework also will help drive the process, and have fun with it, at least at the end of the day. And when the
that's right.
project
Yeah,
comes, you will know what to do, right?
yeah, exactly. It's better to be prepared. Yeah, that's correct.
Better
Yeah.
be prepared. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I just got a question here from Joy, looking if he could get the slides available somewhere. Not sure if you have GitHub or if usually
I
you
can
share the
place them.
slides.
Yeah, I can put them on. Can share them either on SlideShare or on GitHub. No problem. Just look for me somewhere on the social networks, and I will be happy to share them. No problem.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, just before we close off this session, I'd like to invite everybody for next week. Yeah, next Wednesday, April the 6th, we are running all about SQL Server. Not only SQL Server, sorry, performance on SQL Server and on SQL Server on Azure as well. Great session. Hopefully, you guys connected here watching us today can join us next week again. Okay, Dimitri, I want to say thanks very much again for your time here with us. That was definitely very beneficial, and I hope we can see you around another time again.
Yeah, hope to submit some additional sessions. I have a lot of ideas, but keep forgetting. And I'm lucky that you accepted my session from the first deployment, from the first attempt. So yeah, I have some other topics I would like also to discuss with the crowd. So thank you again for having me, and have a nice rest of the day.
Okay, yeah, thanks everybody for joining us, and hopefully I will see you again. Okay, all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.